Hello and welcome to episode 34 of Waly Gisnep's Animated Classics, the podcast where we're revisiting the Walt Disney animated classics in chronological order, evaluating each film on their own merits to see which ones truly stand up to that prestigious title of an animated classic, albeit in our case, a more refined Waly Gisnep animated classic. As always, I am Liam and I'm joined by my very good friend Ben. Ben, which film is up for consideration this time?
This week, Liam, we are looking at the 1999 film Tarzan, Disney's take on the ever-popular character. Going into this, Liam, what were your memories, thoughts, and feelings?
Tarzan is considered to be the last film of the so-called Disney Renaissance, and I never really grouped it with those films. I more so grouped it with the films that came afterwards. But I see why people use Fantasia 2000 as the cutoff point, because it does mark a very sort of sudden change in how they approach the storytelling. But this always felt very different to the films that came before it, and I didn't really grow up with it. It's strange, I was at the perfect age, I was around 9 when it came out, and it just kind of passed me by. And I don't think I watched it for years. I think I caught glimpses of the TV show when I was in my early teens, but that was really it. And then when I came to watching it when I was a bit older, I didn't really get it.
Are you saying you don't empathise and identify with a jungle man?
Well, here's the weird thing. Obviously I don't, but even as a sort of older teenager, I completely missed the point of this film, and going back to it as an adult, there's actually quite a lot that I like here.
I'm interested to hear what the point of this film is, but we'll maybe get to that later on.
So what about yourself then? What's your background with this film?
As I think I've said with the last 4 or 5 films we've looked at, this isn't one I grew up with, even though it came out when I was the perfect age for it. So I only visited it for the first time as an adult, and it's always one that just blurs into the background for me. Whenever I think of it, certainly prior to this revisit, my thoughts are, this film is okay, and I have an okay time watching it, and it's fine. But my memories of it is that it's very by the numbers and safe, and they go, we've got this Disney Renaissance formula down, let's just play it safe and we'll save the wackiness for the noughties. That said, you've mentioned video games a few times in these podcasts. We talked about the Aladdin and Lion King video games for the Super Nintendo and the Mega Drive. This is the only Disney game I played, certainly that was out at the time of the film's release. And I swear the first boss is Sabor, which, having rewatched the film, it's a pretty big deal fighting a leopard. So I think that's pretty hard for the first boss, and that's my excuse for not beating it.
I know that it's the first boss in the Tarzan world in Kingdom Hearts, but saying that, the last boss is Clayton riding a giant invisible chameleon, so it differs quite a lot from the film.
Spoiler warning. Well, for all you know, there is a giant invisible chameleon that Clayton rides, because you wouldn't see it.
It's just quite a funny image, seeing Clayton floating in the air astride something, clearly. Meanwhile, he's shooting at you with his gun. I mean, that's not the weirdest part of the image. The weirdest part of the image is that you're hitting him with a giant key. But as I say, that is the Kingdom Hearts game. But back to the film then. I have to say I really like the opening of this film.
Let's dive into the plot then. So how does the film open?
So there's a lot to get through with this story, and they have no time to waste. They just open straight away with a shipwreck, which was apparently only piloted by a husband and wife and their baby son. I don't know where everyone else on the boat was, but they're not there.
They were eaten by gorillas.
On the way to Africa, though.
Yes, they found out the gorillas ate people, so they were sending them back. This is my headcanon.
So they're actually on their way back and then immediately off the coast get into a shipwreck.
I feel I'm derailing this podcast too soon.
So we see a husband and wife surviving a shipwreck to the sound of Phil Collins.
Yeah, my first note on this film is, yes, Phil Collins. I know this is a soundtrack that some people love, and it did win an Oscar, but I'll put it politely, it's not for me.
As I said, I kind of skipped over this film, and my first introduction to the film and its soundtrack was actually in the South Park episode where they're mocking Phil Collins after he beat them to the Oscar, with just the most ridiculous, mawkish version of this song, and it's all I can hear whenever You'll Be In My Heart plays is just Trey Parker doing a terrible British accent, be like, "You'll be inside me."
I mean, you say a ridiculous, mawkish version of this song. I'd argue that is this song. My complaint about this song, which is Two Worlds, One Family, is that I think it should be called Two Families, One World, because there's not one family. Tarzan has two families, and they've been pushed together in this world, this sort of, uninhabited, certainly by humans, part of North Africa, whereas Two Worlds, One Family suggests that, hey, they're from different places, but they've come together and they're one family. They haven't come together. One family has been eaten by a leopard.
I think what they're going for more is that, and this kind of touches upon what I was getting at with, like, what the point of the film is that it clearly has a strong conservation message, and it's that idea that the great apes are all part of the same family, and we are a lot closer than a lot of people appreciate, really. Obviously, there is a lot that separates us, and that's a big part of this film as well. So I don't mind the lyrics so much, and I'm actually going to say, I don't know what it is. I think I turned 30 and I just suddenly started quite liking Phil Collins. So watching this film again, I quite like the soundtrack.
I can't tell you that you don't like the soundtrack. And there's people listening to this who will like it and people who listen to it who don't. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying I necessarily wanted this film to be another Broadway-style musical in the same vein as Beauty and the Beast and The Little Mermaid, etc. I don't mind experimentation, it's just not for me.
See, you say experimentation, but really this is a step back. This is how all other films do songs, is non-diegetic and almost exclusively used over montages, and I do think there is probably a bit too much reliance on montage in this film, but some of them are done quite well. Like this opening one, I quite like that we're seeing these two parallel families. As you say, it is two families, I'll concede that, but we have these two parallel families.
So it should be called Two Families, Two Worlds.
It should be called Two Families, One Jaguar, Two Tragedies. Because in a cruel twist of fate, the gorillas lose a baby, and Sabor also eats Tarzan's parents. And so we see Carla finding Tarzan, and she's mourning the loss of her child. She sees a child that is in need of a mother, and she makes the decision to take Tarzan in and raise him. There is a slightly annoying bit of... It's kind of like a weird comic set piece between Carla and Sabor, where there's just a few too many things that are played for jokes, and I'm thinking, this is a deadly leopard. This shouldn't be funny.
No. No, it shouldn't. There's some stuff I really like about this opening, don't get me wrong. Like, they have very little dialogue. In fact, there's basically no dialogue for a good chunk of the film. I think it's sort of 10-15 minutes, excluding the song over the top. It's all told visually, which I think is done really well. The attempts of Carla to rescue Tarzan from Sabor, you're right, it is played for laughs. Also, Carla could snap that leopard like a twig. I'm not saying it's a good idea, but I'm saying push came to shove. I know who my money's on in a fight between a gorilla and a leopard.
Yes, but this is a mourning gorilla.
Well, we'll get a night gorilla then. Thank you.
It's weird that on top of the odd comic beats of this scene, the only note I have for this opening is that monkeys would not be bothered by the smell of poo.
That's true.
For context, there is a recurring joke where the monkeys keep smelling Tarzan's diaper and recoiling.
I'm going to push my glasses up my nose, Liam, and say, gorillas are not monkeys. I also think this is something that could conceivably happen. I'm obviously not the stuff of Tarzan learning to speak to apes and, all the later stuff, but I conceivably believe that if a gorilla was mourning and it found a human baby, there's a reasonable chance it would take it in to care for it. Whether it'd be able to or not would be another matter. I think Tarzan certainly got better odds than Mowgli with the wolves.
So, after some comic hijinks, Carla manages to escape Sabor with Tarzan in hand. She goes back to the other gorillas, and they're all shocked to see this strange, hairless creature, but they're all interested, with the exception of the leader of the gorillas, Kerchak, who doesn't want this child near them. He thinks it's going to be a problem, and even if he is alone, if the jungle wants him, the jungle can have him. And when I first saw this film, I never really got Kerchak. I just thought he was antagonistic to Tarzan because he's different. There is a degree of that, but it was only really watching it this time that I appreciated that what Tarzan represents to him is a constant reminder that he was unable to save his son. And I kind of love that. It's nice watching it being like, no, I actually get Kerchak here, and it's a lot more complex than the film ever really acknowledges. They never have a line acknowledging that. Kerchak's lines with him and Tarzan are all about being different and not being part of the family, but it's all in the animation on Kerchak. As you say, a lot of it is visual, and the way his face moves and the way he reacts to certain things that Tarzan does and things that Carla says, particularly about raising Tarzan, just really sell that point that this is just a constant reminder of his failing, and I really like that.
I definitely think the gorillas are where we get a lot of the emotional beats and nuance of this film, for sure. Kerchak is voiced by Lance Henriksen, so I always refer to him as Lance Kerchakson. That's my only contribution on the character of Kerchak.
I completely agree, and whilst the gorillas are the source of really the emotional heart of this film, they are also the source of Rosie O'Donnell.
In this film.
In this film, yes. And I don't know about you, Ben, but this might be my most hated comic relief sidekick. Even more so than Jason Alexander, both in general and in The Hunchback of Notre Dame.
Again, maybe if this was a film I'd watched as a child, I'd have a bit more nostalgia for Turk, who is one of the young gorillas who's basically Tarzan's best friend, and I guess the closest he's got to someone like him in the herd of gorillas. The only interesting thing for me about Turk is, and maybe it's just Rosie O'Donnell's voice or the way Turk's drawn, I think people often misgender Turk, and I don't think the film does a huge amount to clear it up. Going into this, I was like, am I remembering that, maybe this is quite progressive? I was like, no, I think this character is meant to be female. It's just not been communicated very well. I don't think they were trying to go for anything gender fluid or anything like that. I always used to think the character was male but was voiced by a female actor, but I don't think that's meant to be the case.
I completely get what you're saying there. I think I had a similar misunderstanding myself, and I kept an eye out for it. I think there are a few pronouns dropped towards her, and I think it is explicit that she is female. But yeah, I think even just having that friendship, I think, is quite good, and having a female comic relief sidekick is at least breaking the mold for Disney, but I just don't like it. And I know we've talked about this, but everything post Genie, there are characters who it seems like their only purpose is to be comic relief, and it took a long time before Disney started realizing that humor is better sourced from dialogue and wit spread across your characters rather than just here's everything in one character, they're going to be annoying as a result.
And speaking of annoying comedy sidekick characters, we also have Tantor the Elephant, who doesn't do anything in this film.
No, it's strange. We have this big set piece where Tarzan has to get an elephant hair in order to get in with Turk and the other gorillas, which something about those other gorillas, those voices coming out of that animation just does not fit at all, and it's so weird and jarring to me. At least with Turk, the voice fits the animation, and that is a fully rounded, believable character, however annoying she might be. Whereas this is just like two guys doing just normal guy voices, and it's offset with like animal animation, and it just doesn't fit. So yeah, Tarzan has to get an elephant hair, and it results in a stampede, which almost kills one of the other gorillas, further straining that relationship between Tarzan and Kerchak.
Now, for me, there's nothing intrinsically wrong with this sequence, except that it starts to contribute to what might be my biggest criticism of this film is its lack of identity. Now, I want to be clear that on this podcast, we don't necessarily rank things in terms of order. So just because something did something first doesn't necessarily mean we'll give it credit for it. We generally like to look at what did something best. The problem is, I feel this film emulates a lot of films that did these things better, and I don't think it helps that the first major set piece we get after the opening is a stampede of African animals that involve the main character being rescued by a paternal figure. There's such a direct comparison to The Lion King, probably the most memorable scene from The Lion King. It doesn't help Tarzan's case very much.
We're entering an era of Disney where the films, rather than being built around musical numbers or plot points, they seem to be built around action sequences. And often they seem to just be action sequences because that's what films need, and that's what gets bums in seats at cinemas. But what's so memorable about the stampede in The Lion King is the emotional stakes. It takes time to get to this point, and we understand the characters involved and what is at stake. That's what makes that sequence great. Plus, it does just look better as well, if I can be quite honest. I think by cutting away between the elephants and Tarzan, the young gorillas with Tantor, and back to the herd, there's just too many pieces of a very strange tone, because all the stuff with Tarzan is a bit more comical, and then we cut to the herd of gorillas, and that's life or death there. They have to get out of the way, and it just doesn't fit. Again, in terms of animation, it's an impressive set piece, but it's a very hollow one. And so this directly contributes to that further strain between Tarzan and Kerchak, and Tarzan runs off knowing that he is different and that he's never going to be one of the gorillas. And this leads to a sequence that I personally really like, and I think resonated with a lot of people for particular reasons, which is Kala going to Tarzan and comforting him by showing that whilst they're different on the outside, they have so much in common that makes them family and the same. And this is the sequence that has the song You'll Be in My Heart. And I think it's kind of become a kind of anthem for adoptive parents, and I can totally see people going into this film, and if that is relevant to them, just being very moved by this sequence and the song in particular.
I don't know if it says that I'm just a terrible, cold-hearted person, but I have literally no notes on this sequence, because I don't think I think it's a sweet sequence, and again, I think the stuff between Tarzan and Kala is probably the strongest stuff in this film. It certainly feels like the most unique relationship we get in this film. I don't think it's one we've really had in many other Disney films. Obviously, you get a lot of orphans in Disney and people who don't know their parents, but this one genuinely feels like Kala is, to all intents and purposes, Tarzan's mother, and they both struggle with the reality of that even though she's his mother functionally, she's not his mother biologically.
I will add, if just because this sets up my favourite sequence in the film later on, I'm glad this scene exists. I really like it, and the scene that follows it later is fantastic, in my opinion. This is something I'm probably going to say a lot during this discussion, but this sequence leads directly into another Phil Collins montage. Here we have Son of Man, where Tarzan is taking up the challenge of being the best gorilla he can be. And one thing I really like about this montage is that visually it's showing one of the really interesting differences between humans and the other great apes, which is based on the size of our brains. We have this understanding and this level of problem solving that we can do that lets us create and use tools. And they don't make much of a big deal about it in the film, which maybe is a bit of a shame, but we see Tarzan at this point helping the herd through his use of tools and problem solving.
I have a couple of questions about adult Tarzan. The first is, has he been wearing the same loincloth for his entire life?
No, he buys a new one every few years. Unlike Mowgli, they don't really explain the loincloth at all. It's even weirder when Jane shows up and at the end has her own loincloth, and I'm like, where did that come from? I mean, don't get me wrong, I don't want Jane swinging through the jungle naked, but at least maybe fashion it from the clothes she had with her.
Maybe there's a loincloth tree. Who knows? The second question is
it to do with the magical time elephant?
What? No. I was going to ask why he doesn't have a beard. Yours is way more interesting.
Yeah, he is distinctly hairless. I think that's an appropriate choice because that is really the big thing that separates him from the gorillas. And I think if over time he became this big hairy man, they'd be like, oh, it's fine, he was just a late bloomer.
Just have a moment where when he's growing up, he's starting to get a little bit of facial hair, and Carla says to him, no, I like your smooth face. It's what makes you stand out. And he goes, all right then, done. Uses bit of wood to shave his face.
Ben, there's already so much in this film. I don't think we can afford another scene that's just for shaving. Saying that, we get a shaving scene later on. What am I saying?
2 shaving scenes, all the shaving scenes. Liam, I feel you've indulged my nonsense after you dropped the phrase magical time elephant, and I demand you explain yourself.
Well, similar to the magical time log during Hakuna Matata, just before the key change, actually, we see Tantor throw young Tarzan into the air, and when he falls back down, he's now adult Tarzan.
It's not necessarily the case that, he threw Tarzan through time. It could be he threw Tarzan incredibly high, where he was up there for years. So that's my only other comment about adult Tarzan, and his massive chin.
You mentioned his chin, and one thing I could never wrap my head around when I was younger is how old he's supposed to be, and apparently he's like 18, and to me that's a 30-year-old jungle dude. And I think the reason I have that in my head is because of the chin, because apparently no one under the age of 30 can have a chin like that, which is obviously, it's just demonstrably not true.
Well, you say it's demonstrably not true. Don't use this film as hard evidence, because...
But I mean, if I think that someone with that chin looks 30, what did they look like when they were 29? A chin just doesn't suddenly grow overnight.
It does if you've got a magical time elephant. So during this sequence, as you say, we get to see Tarzan doing some more humanoid stuff. One thing we establish is that he sort of surfs on trees, and he's quite agile compared to the gorillas, which are quite unwieldy because they're so bulky. I think tree surfing is the most 90s thing possible. It's like they're like, well, we're making Tarzan, but it's 1999. Let's make him surf on trees. And then they'll go, hey, we're making Treasure Island in 2002. Whenever it was. Let's make him surf on things. Everyone has to surf because surfing's cool.
I'm glad you mentioned Treasure Planet because, yeah, as soon as you said it's the most 90s thing, I was like, nope, I'm pretty sure the most 90s thing is solar surfing in Treasure Planet, even though it was in 2003. So it's after this montage of tooling and tree surfing that we get a fight sequence with Sabor, and I actually think this is one of the few action sequences that I quite like in the film. It's quite tense. You're right, though, any of these gorillas could just destroy this leopard immediately, but Tarzan has to do it, and it's his use of tools that lets him do it. He has a spear that he's fashioned. It's really strange. This is probably a good time to mention that, to me, this 3-act film is probably the most disjointed of any we've seen so far, and this is very much the end of the first act where Tarzan kills Sabor, presents the body to Kerchak, and I didn't realise until watching it today, but this is the moment Kerchak actually accepts Tarzan. It's from this point he is part of the family, and what stands in the way of that is that in the distance we hear a gunshot, and this is the arrival of more people that Tarzan goes to investigate. But even with Tarzan choosing to investigate, Kerchak has still accepted Tarzan, not as his son, but definitely as a member of the family. And it's strange because I really thought that it wasn't until the 3rd act when that happens, but it is at the end of this sort of mini movie in the 1st act. And it's very symbolic. Obviously, Sabor is the one that killed Tarzan's parents. He doesn't know this. Sabor is also the one that killed Kerchak's child. I do feel this scene should have more of an emotional punch than it does. Again, I think most of it is carried by the animation in Kerchak's face. I really should have looked up who the animator for Kerchak was because they are fantastic and they are doing so much for that character.
The supervising animator on Lance Kerchakson was Bruce W. Smith, who also worked on Facilier and The Princess and the Frog and some other films in the sort of noughties era of Disney.
That's really cool. I can see that with Facilier where it's so much of just subtle facial animation, which does so much visual work. So yes, Bruce, if you're listening, easily the standout animation of the film, in my opinion at least.
You touched on the action sequences, and I actually think these might be the standout feature of this film and the thing that does make it feel more unique, other than, as I say, I touched on Tarzan and Carla's relationship. These look amazing. Like, the camera movements in these, or what would be camera movements, because it's animation, are so far ahead of everything else we've had up to this point. I know I've said that a few times, so obviously it's because animation keeps developing. But we get all these shots where they're flying through different angles and we're following Tarzan through the jungle and he's running round trees and down and up and round things. They're really, really solid, and they're often continuous shots as well. I think from a technical perspective, the CGI in this, we've come such a long way, even in 5-6 years. Even looking at something like Hercules, where I think the action in that is fine, but it still feels quite flat in places, whereas this, it feels incredibly dynamic, and these sequences do stand out. I think the closest comparison we've had up to this point in terms of the flow of these sequences would probably be the Merahute sequence at the start of The Rescuers Down Under, but I think I prefer that sequence in terms of what it's communicating, but in terms of the fluidity of movement, I think Tarzan has it beat.
You've basically touched on my issue with the action sequences, though, which is they are all fantastic to look at, but they often just feel like they're there because the animators could do it. This fight with Saburo is the standout one to me because it's really the only one I can think of that comes close to really meaning anything.
And just like that, with a gunshot, the British have arrived.
There's something about Brian Blessed where he just takes me out of any film he's in. It just doesn't ever really seem to fit.
Is it because you constantly expect him to just bellow, "Gordon's alive"?
It's more that it's so unbelievable and comic a voice. It sounds like someone doing a character, but that's just Brian Blessed.
I wonder what it's like for an American or another audience who don't know who Brian Blessed is, because as British people, he's sort of quite a big personality in all senses, and that voice, as you say, is so distinctive that you don't hear a character, you just hear Brian Blessed. I was going to say I think he's miscast as Clayton, but maybe that's just an issue with my awareness of Brian Blessed as a person, and maybe if you don't know that, Clayton actually sounds about right for the character.
That's a really good point, because I was going to say the same, that I think it doesn't fit, but looking at the character of Clayton and the animation, I don't know what voice would go with that other than the Brian Blessed boom. Maybe something a bit more snivelling like Jafar could work, but I still can't get the pieces to fit.
This is it. Clayton's meant to represent pseudo-refinement, so he's got that sort of posh air to his voice, but he also is quite feral and quite masculine, and I think that does come across in the voice. The problem is I don't picture those things when I picture Brian Blessed. I don't picture feral and masculine. So maybe that's the issue. And we got some weird other voice actors here. We've got Minnie Driver as Jane and Nigel Hawthorne as her dad, who was in Yes Minister. It's just such a weird random mishmash of people in this film.
So that's the thing. I say that Brian Blessed takes me out of it, but it's okay because Minnie Driver's performance just sucks me right back in because she is so good as Jane. It might be my favourite voice performance of the Renaissance.
Wow.
Well, it would have been Mufasa, but the problem is I've now heard 2 different versions of Mufasa, and I hate one of them, so it's forever spoiled the first one.
So you're saying the live-action version of The Lion King, you found it so bad, it's retroactively changed your enjoyment of the actual Lion King?
Not just The Lion King, but the wonderful performance of the great James Earl Jones.
Which has been ruined by
the terrible performance of James Earl Jones.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think Jane definitely has the potential to be quite an unlikable or irritating character. And again, my memory of her is that she's a bit wet and a bit rubbish, but actually she does do quite a lot, and she's driving the plot forward, and she's smart, and she takes stuff into her own hands. I think it's slightly weird that she's ostensibly an explorer, and she's not come remotely dressed for exploring, but that soon passes by.
I will happily believe that, because she's less an explorer and more an academic, and even more so she is the daughter of an academic whose passion has clearly rubbed off on her. But he's a weird, old, eccentric man, so obviously he wouldn't prepare her for the reality of actually being an explorer. We see the reality of an explorer. It's Clayton with his guns and his machetes, and then these 2 bumbling academics show up, and in the case of Jane, immediately gets attacked by the jungle.
Yeah, we get this sequence where she manages to aggravates some baboons, and Tarzan has to rescue her. It's a really nice sequence where we see Jane kind of learning about the realities of the jungle, and Tarzan's whole world has changed, that he's encountered other people.
It's a nice enough action set piece. I think it has some beats that I really like, namely, as you say, Jane realizing the horror of the jungle, and there's a wonderful moment when Tarzan grabs her to save her, and she looks up and immediately screams because a strange feral man is carrying her through the jungle. I do think the action sequence goes on a little bit too long. Again, it feels like, I don't even want to call it show-offy, because it isn't show-offy, it's just, as I say, this is what people want, we've got to put these big action sequences in, but if it doesn't mean anything, I don't want an action sequence. It just, my mind just kind of turns off when they happen.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I do think the payoff afterwards, though, which is we get this, it starts with just a simple exchange between Jane and Tarzan of trying to learn to communicate, and then leads into a montage later on. But I actually think the way it's handled is really, really good. Like, I find it incredibly believable that these are how these two people would have to learn to communicate in the first instance. Things like Tarzan not understanding personal space, which is a social construction, it's not a natural one, and the way they have to start really simply learning language, I think is just really, really believable. And again, I think it really anchors the relationship between these two characters.
One thing that is fantastic during this scene is the performance of Tony Goldwyn as Tarzan. It's been set up earlier that he is an excellent mimicker. He likes copying the sounds of the various animals in the jungle. So when Jane meets him and starts talking to her, he just mimics back to her. And she doesn't realise at first that obviously that's what he's doing. He doesn't actually understand her. And his performance, it's so strange because it sounds exactly what you would expect from someone saying these words without actually knowing what they mean. It's so good, and it's so different to the performance he gives when he's actually communicating with the gorillas. Like, that is his language. He's talking very naturally, as if you would see in any other animated film, but then the performance completely changes to show that, like, a hard cut to reality. And this is the first time this character is making sounds like this. And you get all of that from Tony Goldwyn's performance. I think he's fantastic in this sequence. This is one of those sequences in the film where it really strikes at the core of what the film is about, which is Tarzan caught between these two worlds, where he doesn't fit in either. And it's those moments where I really love it. And I think where it matters, this film executes it perfectly. So we have this wonderful scene that gets me every time. Immediately afterwards, we have a gorilla musical number in the camp, and I don't understand it.
I don't know if they were just like, hey, Phil Collins is primarily a percussionist, so let's just do some percussion. My note on this sequence is, this reminds me of Stomp. I hate Stomp.
Do you think that's what it was inspired by, actually?
It was the 90s. That
would make a lot of sense. It's interesting you said about Phil Collins being a percussionist, because whenever I listen to any of the songs, it comes through so strong. You're just like, this guy's definitely a percussionist. It's like, I've been replaying Spyro recently, and the soundtrack for that game was written by Stuart Copeland of The Police. And again, you're on any level and you're just like, this was done by a percussionist. And it's just quite nice when that comes through. And that's very strong in the soundtrack for this film. And I also think quite appropriate. So in the middle of Gorilla Stomp, Tarzan and Jane return to the camp. She obviously is very excited to see all these gorillas, and she realizes that Tarzan is one of them. She sees him interacting with the gorillas and realizes this. And her delivery on that line, like, there's something about it where it just cuts through every time. It's just this really sweet realization about who Tarzan is. And she has an understanding about him that he doesn't have himself. And again, it's from the voice delivery, the animation in her face. There's just so many moments in this film I really like. And the fact that two great moments are sandwiched either side of Gorilla Stomp just makes me angry. And just as Jane is getting close to Turk and she's finally come face to face with the gorillas, it's what she came here for. The other gorillas who have come to investigate all the horrible noise that was being made arrive at the camp. And there's this genuinely terrifying moment where Kerchak stares down Jane, and as you say, like, they are big, powerful creatures, and you know he could, as you say, just tear her in two if he felt it was necessary, but Tarzan steps in. They all leave. I think there's a gunshot that maybe drives them away, but they all leave, and Kerchak announces to the other gorillas that they're going to have to change their behavior. They're going to have to stay away from the coast and stay high in the mountains to avoid the people. Tarzan is obviously protesting. He has finally seen someone else like him. Turk understands as well. Like, there's this, it's all done with the facial animation where you can see that Turk has realized that Tarzan's not just some strange anomaly amongst the gorillas. He is his own thing, and there are others out there like him. And Kerchak is telling him to stay away to protect the family. He's finally been accepted as one of the gorillas, and something is pulling him away. And Kerchak's telling him, you basically have to choose. Except he's not saying that explicitly, but...
He's not good at saying anything explicitly, because he's just a big, stoic male gorilla.
You've kind of hit the heart of what I loved so much about Kerchak watching it today, is that he's such a masculine character and a critique of the masculine, where this idea that you have to be stoic and not talk about things and hold things in can only lead to disaster. And it's something I never appreciated the first time I watched this film. I just saw Kerchak as the angry gorilla who doesn't accept Tarzan because he's different, not this really complicated masculine character who can't express his grief and dealing with this constant reminder of his grief. If it's not clear, I love Kerchak.
Despite this, Tarzan is uncontrollably pulled back to the human camp, although he won't share the location of the gorillas. We get a montage to the song Stranger Like Me, where it alternates between Jane teaching Tarzan about society and teaching him language and culture, and Clayton demanding, in increasing frustration, for the location of the gorillas. There's one particular moment where he holds up a map that's at most 2 foot squared that just has all of Africa on, and he points at it, asking Tarzan to show him where the gorillas are. And I was like, even if Tarzan knows where he is, the detail on that map is not going to be enough, Clayton.
I really like the frustration of Clayton and his very pathetic attempts at trying to get to the gorillas. And I think part of that is in Brian Blessed's performance, so it does work quite well in that regards, I suppose. Another thing I love about this montage is we are seeing a third element, which is we're seeing Tarzan still going about his day-to-day life with the gorillas. And we see Carla and Turk noticing that he's going away more and more and that he's just not there anymore. Even when he's physically present, his mind is elsewhere and they are losing him. Just as he's finally been accepted, he's become obsessed with this other world. I do have a criticism though. Whilst I like the song and I like the montage, this is something that I feel could have been done better outside of a montage, maybe over a bit more time, a few more scenes, because by the end of this song, the explorers are ready to leave. They've ran out of time and they are leaving because their time has run out.
I have mixed feelings about that. On the one hand, I'm always glad when a film gets on with it, and I'm also glad that they put Tarzan front and centre. One criticism we had of Pocahontas was that they can't decide whether they want to make Pocahontas the focus or they want to show these as 2 separate groups of people and how they interact. And it kind of means that Pocahontas sometimes gets sidelined and doesn't have enough time for an interesting arc and to develop her character. I think we do get that here with Tarzan, which I think is about right. But yeah, there's definitely a case to say that we miss a lot of what we'd like to see. I think they do it fairly efficiently, though.
Efficiency is probably the right word. And I do love this sequence. As I say, I think this is a kind of the core of any Tarzan story and something we haven't really got from a previous Tarzan adaptation, which is the identity struggle of being between these 2 worlds. And I think this film handles that really well. And again, I think that is probably because they've chosen to focus on Tarzan rather than the different groups. I just wish there were maybe less in this film so that we could focus more on that identity struggle. I feel that first act, which is, as I say, it's a film in its own right that ends with Tarzan killing Sabor. Could that have been done more efficiently instead? Because this second act of Tarzan discovering the people and then, oh, the people need to go, it feels like it's a blink and you miss it, and it's supposed to be the core of the Tarzan story.
Maybe this again parallels The Lion King, where we love the first half of that film, and we really like the second half of that film, but we feel it is a little bit weaker. And maybe that's because we get so much time setting up young Simba and all this stuff, and then we get less time with adult Simba, where basically adult Simba just has to have a revelation and fix everything. I feel this maybe suffers from the same thing, except I think with a lot of young Tarzan, we don't really get much of a character come through from him or much of an arc. Like, don't get me wrong, there's some nice scenes between him and Carla, but a lot of it, nothing particularly develops there. So yeah, I probably could have lost 5-10 minutes from young Tarzan and used that as an adult.
The Lion King's a really good comparison because with young Simba, I love all of that, but feel the second half is rushed. My problem here is I love the ideas behind adult Tarzan, and I just feel they don't have enough room to breathe, whereas I don't think there are any ideas really with old Simba. It's all just resolving stuff that was set up when he was a child. Like, I don't think Matthew Broderick Simba has an identity other than, you better go back and fix all the nonsense that was set up 20 minutes ago.
But in a wider sense, Liam, isn't that true of all of us?
The point is, Tarzan struggling with his identity should be the core of this film, and it's the most interesting aspect and the most unique part of this take of Tarzan, which is bewildering to me. When you think of Tarzan, that should be the first thing that comes to mind, and no one's ever done that. They've just been like, he's king of the jungle, and he talks to monkeys. It's like, how does that affect him?
It's ironic, because you're right. The best parts of this film and what should be the focus of this film is Tarzan's identity, and the weakest parts of this film is when this film feels like it's losing its identity because it's too much like other Disney films. So yeah, identity is clearly the word at the centre of this film.
And speaking of identity, this leads us to a couple of my favourite sequences in this film. As I say, this second act is the emotional core of the film to me, and I think it is probably its strongest element. Tarzan, kind of tricked by Clayton, thinks that if he shows Jane the gorillas, she will stay with him. So with the help of Tantor and Turk, they lure Kerchak away, and Tarzan takes Jane, the professor, and Clayton to the gorilla's nest to basically introduce Jane to his mother. And it's, again, this lovely sequence where Carla is sort of backing away and Tarzan explains that it's his mother, and you see it in the animation on Jane's face, just that complete understanding of who Tarzan is. It's great. Tarzan's identity crisis should be the key part of this, but without saying anything, we know that Jane completely understands his identity. This is kind of a heartbreaking moment for Carla where she realizes that Tarzan fits more with these people than with her and her family, and she backs away. But Tarzan reassures everyone, and the gorillas come to interact with Jane and the professor. Meanwhile, there's some villainous machinations going on in Clayton's head because we need a villain and we need a third act, yada yada yada. But Carla is still heartbroken, which leads to my favourite sequence in the whole film, which is where Carla decides that she needs to tell Tarzan where he's from and who he is so that he can actually make a decision about his identity. So she takes him to the treehouse where he sees, hopefully not his parents' corpses, but I mean...
It's been 20 years, Liam. Probably not much left.
You say that, but what I love about this sequence is she gives him the choice, and the next moment he steps out wearing his father's suit, signifying that he's choosing to return to England with the people.
Well, not necessarily. Maybe he just is like... sick of wearing the same loincloth for 20 years.
I'm hoping it was a suit in a drawer and not the suit on the skeleton, is my point. But again, the animation, it's completely non-verbal. We see Tarzan step out in the suit, telling the audience and telling Carla what his decision is, and she's heartbroken. Even though she knows it's what he's chosen and what's best for him, he's still her son, and they share a moment where he says, no matter where I am, you'll always be my mother. And as I mentioned earlier, this film meant a lot to adoptive parents, and I think is one of the best representations of that relationship in a film, even if it is between a man and a gorilla. I think it's done so well, and I can see why it resonated with so many parents and so many children who are adopted.
We often talk about representation on this podcast, and often we talk about it in terms of ethnicity and sexuality and gender, but I think that's just as valid a point is representation of other underrepresented groups. And I think we get something similar in Lilo and Stitch, where I think it handles a very specific kind of relationship that a lot of children are going to have, and you don't see a lot in cinema. So yeah, I'll absolutely give this film credit for absolutely nailing that.
And with all of the emotional heart out of the way, it's time to move on to the big stupid third act.
So Clayton, having finally ascertained where the gorillas are based, Clayton says to one of the sailors there's going to be a change of plan, which suggests that at no point before was his plan to kidnap the gorillas, at which point, why was he there? Because he clearly wasn't there just to see gorillas. So I don't know what his money-making scheme was up until that point. Maybe he just wanted to shoot them, and he's like, actually, what would be even better than shooting them would be making loads of money. So him and all the evil sailors conspire to kidnap the gorillas.
I have a few points here, which is, one, no one reacts to Tarzan showing up in a full three-piece suit. And two, why doesn't Clayton and the sailors just kill everyone? Why are they holding them prisoner and taking them back to England? It'd be so much easier to say they died in the jungle. Also, I've got a whole herd of gorillas here to sell you. Rather
than get back and say, oh, we mutinied and kidnapped these people.
Yeah.
Which they will attest to. He's not the smartest villain. Let's just give him that, alright?
I just love how comically villainous all of the sailors are.
Yeah, I think you see the captain's been locked up with Jane and her dad and Tarzan, presumably to fill in the hole of who's going to sail this boat back. Which, again, is a tall ask for one man, especially at the end of this film when he is just one man sailing a boat.
And that's the thing. At the end of this film, the boat goes back, but surely either all of the mutineers were killed or
eaten by gorillas.
Or they were like, sorry about that, we were following Clayton's orders. Can we help you get back to England? To which, if I was the captain, I'd say, no.
We were blinded by gorilla fever. We just wanted some gorillas.
So yeah, there's not much to say about this third act other than it's a big dumb third act where there's a set piece where Tantor breaks everyone out of the boat by climbing onto it, which is very weird. And all of the gorillas get captured in cages. Some comically villainous sailor henchmen get thwarted and presumably left to die in the jungle.
They basically have the same fight as at the end of Beauty and the Beast, where all the nondescript henchmen have like comic fightings with the nondescript good guys.
And it's strange because I don't know what the third act should have been. Because if I was to sit down and write this film, and as I say, write with the focus on Tarzan's identity being the emotional core, you do need a clash where the world he is leaving to is shown to be evil. You do need that, and this does that. It's incredibly functional, but it's not interesting.
So I think the thing this needs to do is to parallel the conflict with Sabor, which happens at the end of the first act, because through Sabor, Tarzan learns that the world he's known is dangerous, and by living in it, there's a risk to him and a risk to people he cares about. Then in the second act, he encounters humans, and they're, as far as he can tell, civilized, and he can put all this risk behind us and all this risk to people he cares about. So the third act and the showdown with Clayton should reflect that actually humanity's just as dangerous, even though it appears more refined, and it's kind of joining that circle. And we do get that a bit, but I think we get so little time with Clayton. All we get is he shoots things and he wants the gorillas. That's all we get. I feel there should be a moment where either Tarzan has to embrace his animalism to best Clayton, or he should have to show that he's more refined and human. And there's an effort to do that where Clayton tries to shoot Tarzan, and Tarzan, when given the opportunity, throws the gun away and chooses not to. I get what they're doing. There's not enough of a visual or thematic connection with that and the fight with Sabor.
I have an idea. How about we simplify the third act? We cut all the mutineering sailors and it's just Clayton. In the same way that it was just Sabor, it's just Clayton. And he is either after one gorilla in particular, maybe just wants to kill one and take it back as a specimen, or he sees Tarzan himself as a commodity. Because the problem is by taking them in alive, he needs help. That's why you need all the mutineering sailors, which does not work, in my opinion. It makes the third act too big and too silly. So is the answer to just have Clayton after one prize gorilla? And I'm not talking, oh, it's a mythical white gorilla. I want that specific one. Literally just, while we're here, as payment, I want one gorilla that we can take back for the museum.
I think that would work. Or I think alternatively, you do keep an aspect of the mutineer sailors or some kind of neutral party that is happy to have Tarzan be brutalized and treated like an animal. And Tarzan shows that he's more humane than Clayton, even though he's not come from high society or whatever. And in doing that, this neutral party kind of sides with Tarzan over Clayton, and Clayton, in desperation, tries to shoot them or whatever. I think we just need some slightly more clear validation of what Tarzan's journey's meant to be and how he deals with these two different identities, because I think we get some really interesting questions and not much in the way of interesting answers.
For all of my problems with this third act, I think the confrontation with Clayton is incredibly well done. And as you say, Tarzan is given the opportunity to shoot him, and when goaded with "go on, be a man," he says, "but not a man like you," showing that sort of understanding that this other world he is a part of isn't all just guns and brutality, and he has a choice over who he is. There isn't really much of that identity, but I think the confrontation is very tense. I think the animation is fantastic, and it also leads to one of, if not the most brutal Disney villain deaths.
So if you've not seen this film in a while, basically, Clayton, in desperation, attacks Tarzan with his machete. They both fall into vines, and Tarzan manages to get Clayton all tangled up in them. Clayton starts hacking away at them, not realising there's one vine that's tightening around his neck. Clayton falls down. We get his machete land in the foreground. We see the rope tighten, and then we get a lightning flash showing silhouette of Clayton's corpse hanging there. And what I think is so unnecessarily hardcore is, if that sequence was just Clayton cuts the vines and he's not paying attention and he falls to his death, no one would question that. Everyone would be like, yep, classic Disney death, villain falls to their death. But the animators went out of their way to say, you need to know he was hanged and his neck broke and that's how he died. There's no ambiguity, you have to know that.
It's all just these little extra steps they take. As you say, the choice to have him hanged, and then the machete hits the floor and you realise what has happened and you're like, oh god. And then the lightning bolt strikes and you're like, oh god. It's amazing what you can get away with in a PG film.
I mean, to be fair, Scar was eaten alive in Silhouette, so I think what we've learned is you can do anything in Silhouette, basically. I think I'd prefer that to a lot of the Disney fates, like being dragged into hell or eaten alive. I think just a quick and painless death is what I'd choose. Obviously, I'd rather not be a Disney villain and get killed by my own hubris, but I'm saying if I had the choice, this is probably what I'd go for.
We should mention during this confrontation, Kerchak is shot by Clayton and mortally wounded, and this is the moment where Kerchak not only explicitly states that Tarzan is one of them, but that he is also his son. And as I say, it's really strange watching that, because such a strong emotional beat. When I was younger, I overlooked the fact that Kerchak welcomes Tarzan at the end of the first act. It's just that what he hasn't done until this point is let go of his own guilt, and particularly the way that he projected that guilt onto Tarzan, and that's what this scene represents. But yeah, Kerchak entrusts the herd to Tarzan, says they're going to look to him now, so obviously he can't go back to England now. He has responsibility, he knows his place. It doesn't matter that he is born from a different world. It's that unique mix of the two worlds that makes him best suited to look after his family, which I really like, and I really like as an ending to his character arc. Again, I think there could have been a few better and clearer steps focused around his identity leading us here, but as a culmination of a character arc, I think it's really good.
Tarzan's finally come to terms with who he is and found his place in the circle of life, and Jane and her father are now going back on this either one-man or incredibly perilous boat full of mutineers boat journey back to England. And Jane, after thinking about it, she realises that she's connected not only with Tarzan but the world he represents, and her father encourages her to go back and to join him. And then shortly afterwards, he decides to do so as well. And I just imagine Jane rocking up on the beach going, I am woman and I am with nature. And her dad's like, oh, I'm here as well. And she's like, oh, I didn't realise when you told me to go that you were going to be here as well.
For a film that says so much with its visuals, this ending there is a line where the professor turns to Jane and says, I can't help but feeling that you should stay, which is a terrible line. And there is a moment at the end of spoilers for Toy Story 4, by the way, but if you haven't seen it by now, just watch it. It's great. Well, that's debatable, but I think it's great. Ben, don't comment. There is a line at the end where Woody is given the dilemma about whether he should stay with his friends or go off and become a lost toy. And the writing in that scene is so perfect, where you know what is being said by the lines, but it's not just explicit where Buzz turns around and says, you should go and become a lost toy because that's what is best for you. Whereas that's what we have here, and it's so strange that it's basically the same scene. The writing in this is so much worse, and it's at the end of a film that did so much visually.
And it's so easy to get around as well, because just in that montage earlier when Jane's teaching about society, have Tarzan give her something or wrap something around her arm that represents, that she's an honorary part of the tribe, or it's like, oh, this is how I've learned to heal wounds, or here's something, it's a tooth from Sabor, this is really meaningful to me. And you can just have Jane touch that or look at it and go, oh, actually, this is what I want, and she just jumps out of the boat. It's not a hard fix.
Absolutely. It's so jarring to me that at the end of this film, they're just like, I don't know how to do this, we'll just have to say it with dialogue. And then, as you say, he stumbles up on the beach himself, and you're like, oh, God.
He's not going to last long.
Does that mean, then, the boat is literally just the captain?
Well, yeah, you kind of want to cut back and him being like, well, that was weird. So my crew mutinied and then died, and then I started taking these guys back and they just jumped off. This is going to be a weird trip.
When he gets back to England, he is going to have so many questions waiting for him.
Just immediately arrested, and what happened? Look.
There was a man, he lived with the gorillas.
And that's pretty much it. We get one last scene of Tarzan swinging through the jungle once again, and as mentioned earlier, both the Professor and Jane now have their own respective loincloths, and they've embraced Mother Nature as well. And that is Tarzan. But before we give our final thoughts and make our decision as to whether Tarzan is worthy of going on the very refined list of Waly Gisnep's animated classics, Liam, is there anything else we need to talk about regarding this film?
There is just one thing, and I think we've got a fairly easy discussion ahead of us today, because we need to decide who is the sexiest character in this film full of gorillas and 4 human characters. So Ben, who is the sexiest character in Tarzan, and why is it the wonderfully ripped Tarzan?
I mean, that's a very loaded question, because you basically answered why it's Tarzan. He is incredibly muscular, but I think he's done in quite a realistic way. Not necessarily in terms of his proportions, because he's sort of, the way characters are drawn in this, they've got quite exaggerated limbs. But compared to, your Tritons and your Gastons, which are just a sort of upside down triangle, he's got this sort of sinewy, lean physique, which I think is quite, in relative terms for the visual style of this film, I think is quite believable and realistic. Obviously, his chin is ludicrously proportioned. It takes up about half the total mass of his head. But yeah, he's a handsome guy.
I am incredibly envious of Tarzan. Next time I'm working with a personal trainer, I just want to take a picture of him and say, do this to me, please. Mainly because he looks like that and he's still got terrible posture. Whereas normally, they'd be like, well, first we need to work on your posture. And I'd be like, nope, I want to walk around like a gorilla and still look that damn sexy.
So you want to be toned and buff, but you also want to have terrible posture. You want to keep the terrible posture in this dream scenario. I think the only other character you'd reasonably consider is Jane, maybe Clayton, but I think really it's almost certainly Tarzan. Jane's makeup in this film is incredibly hardy. It survives a monsoon without running. Fair play to her. The other thing about Jane and Tarzan, we've not really touched on their relationship too much. Now, personally, I find it a bit creepy, and the reason is, Tarzan is an adult, right? I think he says he's 18, 19, 20, around that, so he's clearly an adult, but mentally, I don't know if he could really say he's of a comparable age to Jane in this, and I find it a little bit weird.
You're absolutely right. There's definitely a power imbalance in terms of the societal education and age, but as I think the film sort of handles quite well, they're different types of experience, and in the end, she goes to his world. In many ways, she becomes a child gorilla. Like, all of the other gorillas are like, she can't speak to us, she's the weird mute woman who's 20 years behind the rest of us. So if anything, by the end of the film, it's fine.
You're saying their creepiness balances...
Yes. I will also add that other than the weirdly sexy loincloth she gets at the end, Jane is not a particularly sexualized character. I think she's feminine without being sexualized, and in much the same way that Clayton is masculine without being sexualized, whereas Tarzan, on the other hand, just seems to ooze sexual energy. But maybe that's me just projecting because he's got that body that I want so badly. And with that, there's only one thing left to do. So Ben, if you can take a moment and change into your ceremonial loincloth for the potential induction ceremony for another Waly Gisnep animated classic, I shall open the vault and retrieve the ever-exclusive scroll.
I'm one step ahead of you, Liam. Despite appearances, I'm already wearing my loincloth. I'm just wearing clothes over it.
So I think I'm just going to say it. This is a flawed film. I think it is clearly suffering an identity crisis. As I said, of all the films we've seen so far, this is the one where that 3-act structure really feels quite disjointed. I think the experiment with the soundtrack is interesting, and it really is a mixed bag. I can totally see why people don't like it. Personally, I really like it, and I don't think it would have worked as a traditional musical. And I think the songs add something that would not be there in a film without that musical support. But I get it. I also get the distaste for Phil Collins. As I say, I think it was only really this year that I really started quite liking Phil Collins. I've always liked Peter Gabriel, and I'm always like, well, if I like Peter Gabriel, what's the point of liking a worse version of Peter Gabriel? But then, like every white guy, I hit 30 and was like, you know what? Phil Collins is all right.
I remind you, Liam, you made a big deal when we did Oliver and Company of being a Billy Joel fan your whole life.
I'm in no position to criticise. That's a very good point. All that said, I think the emotional core of this film does something that no other Disney film has done. That relationship between Tarzan and Carla is so strong and gets me basically every scene they're in together. And I think there is a really good film in here. I don't like the 3rd act. I don't like the comic relief. Those factors alone, I shouldn't really want to put this anywhere near this list. But honestly, I think I love this film, and I want it to go on.
I feel the impression I may have given on this podcast is that I don't think this film's very good, and that is definitely not the case. I think there's a lot of really good stuff in this film, and I think the stuff that's not so good, I don't think is bad. I don't think there's a scene or a moment or a specific element of this that just kills it dead, which there are in other films we've talked about, that just a certain element of it just ruins the whole experience. I definitely don't think that's the case here.
Not even Gorilla Stomp.
I immediately retract my previous comment. That said, we talked a lot about identity in this podcast, and I think this film very much feels like a product of the Disney Renaissance being fine-tuned in the formula, which I've already talked about. I don't think it helps that the setting invariably leads to comparisons to The Lion King, to The Jungle Book, even to Bambi to a certain degree, and I think it really makes this film feel less unique. If The Rescuers Down Under and The Little Mermaid swapped places when they came out, I think everyone would say the Disney Renaissance still started with The Little Mermaid. I don't think they'd bump it back and say it started with The Rescuers Down Under. If you swap the places of this and what the next film was chronologically, Fantasia 2000, I think people would say the Disney Renaissance ended with Mulan. And I kind of share that sentiment. I definitely don't think this is a bad film. I think it's a very safe film. And I think while there's some good stuff in it, I think it's the definition of mediocre 3-star. Overall, it's perfectly watchable, but also it's never one that draws me back. So for me, it's a no.
Well, it looks like we put our loincloths on for nothing, because Tarzan has not made it onto the list of Waly Gisnep's animated classics, but because we are torn, procedure dictates that we write Tarzan on the back, ready to move to the front if anyone can make a case for it either being placed on the front or removed entirely.
Now, I know I helped implement this system, but also I don't like it because I feel I'm the one who always says no, and it's very rare people jump in to agree with someone being negative, but people will often get very defensive about films they love, so I feel this just throws down the gauntlet. That said, feel free to argue with me and tell me why I'm wrong.
I wouldn't worry about it, Ben. I think the problem is that you're just more persuasive than me, and so if you really like a film, I will just agree regardless of my feelings going into it.
You're just trying to avoid conflict. But of course, this is just one set of opinions. Who do you agree with on this? Do you agree with Liam that although admitting this is a flawed film, it's still worthy of going on the list? Maybe you don't think it is a flawed film and is the Disney Renaissance going out on a bang and not a whimper? Or do you fall to my school of thinking where the flaws are just a bit too much and it's just a bit too mediocre and lacks identity? As always, we're very keen to hear what your thoughts are on Tarzan, and indeed, as always, who you think the sexiest character is. And with that, we've closed the vault for another week, and we prepare ourselves to watch another one of the Walt Disney animated classics. Liam, what film are we looking at next time?
Well, since we've already discussed Fantasia 2000 in a previous episode, we're going to be jumping ahead. And I can say you don't need to worry about remembering your ceremonial loincloth next time, because I think the vault is saying well and truly closed, because we are moving on to a film that you once described as the cinematic equivalent of the silence from Doctor Who. We are looking at the year 2000's experimental cinematic experience, Dinosaur. Now, I'm pretty sure I've seen this film once. I'm not looking forward to having to watch it again.
This film is so forgettable, I'm going to have to make extensive notes so I can talk about it, because otherwise I'm not going to remember anything about it. I've seen Home on the Range once, and whilst I don't think it's a strong film, I can remember specific parts of it. If you told me I'd imagined Dinosaur, I'd probably believe you.
We've gotten through some rough times in this podcast. We've sat through the Aristocats, we've sat through the Black Cauldron. We did those, we knew this was coming, we're going to have to do this. If you're interested, feel free to watch along with us. In fact, no, if you're listening next week, you have to suffer as well. So please do watch Dinosaur before our next episode and join us next time on Waly Gisnep's Animated Classics.